Hey guys, tonight we slip softly back in time, to a place where lace doilies catch candle drips, bread is baked in brick ovens, and something rustles gently across the floorboards. You glance down from your worn wool stockings and see it, a squirrel, tail fluffed like a feathered fan, trotting confidently across the kitchen like it owns the place. And it kind of does. You're in a house from the 1600s, and yes, the family has a pet squirrel. Not in a cage, not hidden from guests, but out in the open, sleeping on linen scraps and stealing bits of sweet apple from the windowsill. You blink a few times, wondering if this is a dream. Surely you're imagining things. Squirrels are for trees and nut-hoarding chaos, not candlelit kitchens. But here, in this old timber-framed home with hand-woven rugs and pickled onions in the pantry, the squirrel is part of the family. It chitters softly, climbs up the sleeve of the housewife kneading dough, and curls itself onto a pillow by the hearth as if it's the cat. Except, there isn't a cat. There's just the squirrel. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where, and when, people are listening in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the middle of an English kitchen in, say, 1663. The fireplace crackles, casting long shadows across hanging herbs and iron cooking pots. The air smells of dried rosemary, sourdough crust, and smoke. A spinning wheel turns gently in the corner, its rhythm almost hypnotic. But it's not the creak of wood or the low mumble of boiling broth that draws your attention. It's the soft, rhythmic padding of tiny claws. The squirrel has returned. This particular squirrel is named Beatrix. You didn't name her, of course. The woman by the hearth did. She's got her hair pulled into a tightly wound bun, a white apron smeared with flour, and a patience that seems to come from years of tending to living things. Gardens, children, husbands, and this odd little creature who now sits on her shoulder like a furry epaulet. It turns out, Beatrix isn't even unusual. In this village, in this era, keeping squirrels as pets isn't unheard of. It's actually a quiet little trend among housewives. Particularly the clever, slightly mischievous kind who like their tea hot, their stitching neat, and their animal companions just a bit wilder than a lapdog. Why squirrels? You'll find out more in the next section. But for now, you simply observe. The squirrel seems remarkably tame, hopping lightly from stool to shelf, occasionally stopping to nose at a wooden spoon or peer curiously into a basket of wool. And the housewife? She barely reacts. It's like she trained a squirrel to act like a roommate who pays rent in acorns and entertainment value. Across the room, an older gentleman sits on a low chair, polishing boots. He mutters something about darned tail monsters, but the glint in his eye gives him away. He's charmed, too. Even the toddler in the corner seems unbothered. She's attempting to feed the squirrel a raisin, holding it out in pudgy fingers, and laughing when Beatrix delicately plucks it away with her tiny claws. You wouldn't be blamed for thinking this is all made up. But in fact, there's historical precedent. During the 1600s, especially in parts of England, France, and colonial America, squirrels began to appear in diaries, sketchbooks, and even estate records, not as pests or targets of the stew pot, but as genuine pets. Some were imported grey squirrels, others were native reds, caught young and raised with great care. Pet shops, such as they existed at the time, even listed squirrels among their more exotic wares, alongside monkeys, songbirds, and the occasional caged hedgehog. Now, here's your first fun historical fact. There's a surviving letter from 1609 in which a Dutch merchant describes his wife's cinnamon-tailed sprite, a pet squirrel who was fierce to guests but tender to her hand. That's a squirrel with attitude. And apparently, manners. But here's a curious fringe detail you won't hear in your high school history class. Some women reportedly believed squirrels had emotional healing properties. Not because of any medical proof, mind you, but because their soft fur and gentle movements calm the nerves. Sort of like the 1600s version of an emotional support animal, though this one might chew through your embroidery thread if left unattended. Scholars still argue whether the trend was rooted more in practicality or novelty. Was the squirrel simply a convenient animal to tame, being small, clever, and already present in the local forests? Or did it represent something more, a rebellion against the stiff roles women were expected to fill? After all, keeping a squirrel instead of a canary or cat was a little bit rebellious. It was a furry middle finger to domestic conformity. And that's kind of charming, don't you think? But tonight, there are no arguments, just quiet. The squirrel hops into a small hammock near the fire, made of leftover linen stitched carefully with the initials BH. Beatrix's house, maybe? Or Beatrix herself? Hard to say. The housewife returns to her kneading, murmuring a song under her breath. You sit on a low stool nearby, warm from the fire and oddly soothed by the idea that, in this place, squirrels are more than backyard acrobats. They're cherished companions. Of course, not everyone approved. In whispered tones, some neighbors warned that pet squirrels might be unnatural. One story even suggested that a woman's squirrel learned to steal buttons from her husband's coat, leading to a marital spat and a brief accusation of witchcraft. But that's a tale for another night. Or maybe a few sections from now. For now, you just listen. The squirrel is snoring. Yes, really, tiny huffs, like a wind-blown feather rustling across parchment. You can almost feel the rhythm of it lulling you deeper into the world of this curious household, where nothing feels quite like the present, and yet everything is comfortingly real. You start to wonder, if someone 400 years from now found your pet hamster or parakeet, would they be just as surprised? Or would they recognize in you the same simple, strange joy that comes from loving a creature others find ridiculous? The fire crackles. The shadows sway. And Beatrix curls her tail over her nose. All is quiet now. Let's be honest, even in today's world of alpaca farms and pet tarantulas, the idea of a housewife in the 1600s waking up and thinking, you know what my sitting room needs? A squirrel, still feels delightfully unhinged. You sit in the kitchen, fire dimming into lazy embers, and try to wrap your head around it. Why squirrels? Of all the woodland creatures scampering through the hedgerows and orchard trees, why not a bird, a rabbit, or even a toad with a tiny waistcoat? But no. It was the squirrel. Bushy-tailed, nimble, occasionally destructive, and somehow a perfectly acceptable household companion. The answer, as you begin to learn, is complicated, charming, and slightly ridiculous. It starts, in part, with availability. Squirrels were everywhere, especially the native red squirrels of Britain and Northern Europe, whose rusty coats and bright eyes made them look like living ornaments. In the early modern period, forests and groves bordered even the busiest of towns, and many homes had gardens or orchards nearby where squirrels would roam. Children and housemaids could easily trap baby squirrels using baskets or nets, sometimes after finding them fallen from a nest during storm season. And once you had a baby squirrel, small enough to wrap in a handkerchief and carry in your pocket, taming it was just a matter of patience, soft whispers, and frequent treats. So yes, convenience played a role. But it wasn't just about access. You lean back and glance at Beatrix, now snuggled into a small bundle of wool atop the windowsill, paws twitching gently in sleep. There was something else going on, something emotional. In a world without television, therapy, or true personal privacy, companionship took on different shapes. A squirrel, always moving, always curious, offered a kind of quiet excitement. Women spent long, repetitive hours cooking, sewing, and managing the household, duties that were often isolating and emotionally numbing. A squirrel darting across the room, climbing up your sleeve, or playfully stealing your needle offered an unscheduled moment of chaos. And honestly, that chaos felt alive. Now, here's your straight historical fact of the evening. An inventory from a modest estate in 1671 listed, among its household curiosities, a squirrel of excellent manner, fed from hand and trained to stillness. Trained to stillness. Imagine that, a squirrel, the embodiment of kinetic mischief, taught to sit quietly on command. It may sound absurd, but that entry wasn't unique. Squirrels appeared in multiple estate inventories, often listed alongside more conventional pets like lapdogs and parakeets, but sometimes ranked higher in value. Not just a novelty, an investment. But there's a stranger thread woven through this history, and it starts to unravel in your mind as you notice the strange little paintings hanging in the corridor just beyond the kitchen. Tiny portraits. You squint in the low light. Yes, each one features a small creature. Cats, yes. A parrot. A fox on a velvet leash. And then, unmistakably, a squirrel, sitting in profile, with a red ribbon around its neck and a slightly smug expression, like it just finished composing a sonnet. And that brings us to the fringe tidbit for this section. Some women believed squirrels were smarter than most people gave them credit for. A few personal diaries suggest that these animals could discern tone, mimic household patterns, and, this is real, recognize their own names as spoken by familiar voices. Did squirrels really understand their names? Possibly. Probably not. But when you're spending your days steeped in herbs, vinegar, laundry, and the quiet hum of self-imposed decorum, it doesn't take much to convince yourself that your tiny pet is practically a roommate. Maybe even the cleverest one. Still, not everyone agreed on the merits of keeping squirrels. Some religious leaders viewed pet keeping as frivolous or even vain, especially when the pets had accessories, like collars, bells, or tiny beds. One pamphlet from the Puritan era scolded women who dressed beasts as babes and talked to them as lords, warning that such behavior weakened the moral fiber of the household. This leads us to tonight's scholarly debate. Historians continue to disagree about the role pet keeping played in shaping early modern domestic culture. Some argue it was a harmless outlet for affection in a world where emotional expression was often restricted, especially for women. Others contend it was a subtle form of rebellion, women exerting control and care over creatures as a stand-in for independence they were otherwise denied. The pet squirrel, then, wasn't just a quirky trend, it was a symbol. A tiny, twitchy, tree-climbing middle finger to gender norms. But here's something even more interesting. You hear from a visitor, seated across the fire, that squirrels weren't just pets. They were conversation starters. In parlors and sewing circles, women would swap stories of their squirrel's exploits. One might boast of how hers could open a cupboard latch. Another would describe a squirrel that learned to drink milk from a silver spoon. These weren't just anecdotes, they were status updates in a time before social media. Forget your number of followers. Back then, it was all about how talented your squirrel was. And that's where the jokes come in. One woman, supposedly named Marjorie of Gloucester, once said her squirrel was a better judge of character than her pastor. Another remarked that her squirrel refused to approach her mother-in-law, which she took as divine confirmation. And, in perhaps the most painfully relatable 1600s MIC drop, a young wife scrawled in her diary, "My squirrel loves me. My husband notices neither of us." The squirrel wasn't just there for show. It became emotional ballast. Something you could hold, talk to, feed, and train. Something that responded, however erratically, to your care. There's something beautifully vulnerable about that. You step outside with the housewife for a moment. The evening air is cool, heavy with the smell of wood smoke and wet soil. She carries Beatrix nestled in a pocket, murmuring to her like she's reciting secrets. The squirrel peeks out briefly, sniffs the breeze, and ducks back into the wool. It's a sight that would make a modern Instagram explode. But here, it's just Tuesday. You watch them wander to the well, refill a bucket, and head back inside. The squirrel never tries to escape. It seems to know exactly where it belongs. As you re-enter the kitchen, it's hard not to feel a little envious. Sure, squirrels can be unruly, unpredictable, and sometimes bitey. But they're also loyal in their own weird way. They return. They climb back up your arm. They curl up in your apron folds like little pinecone-shaped dreams. The housewife settles down again, Beatrix in her lap now, and begins threading a needle. She hums a song, one of those haunting, half-melancholy tunes you never quite remember the words to but always recognize the melody of. The squirrel's tail flicks once, twice, and then stills. You think to yourself, in a world that rarely let women be anything other than quiet and dutiful, perhaps the squirrel represented something else entirely. A spark, a flicker of wildness, a reminder that somewhere, buried under all the chores and obedience, there was still mischief, still freedom. And that's probably why, if given the choice, they didn't pick cats or rabbits. Cats were known, yes, but too aloof. Rabbits were cute but silent. Squirrels? They were clever, vocal, chaotic, and brave. Everything a well-behaved woman in 1660 wasn't supposed to be, but secretly wanted to be. The hearth dims. The squirrel stirs. And you sit there a little longer, listening to the sounds of a time gone by, grateful for a world strange enough to make room for pet squirrels. The morning sun filters through tiny panes of imperfect glass, casting soft golden rectangles across the wooden floor. The house feels sleepy, but not silent, because somewhere in the corner, you hear the faint rustle of paws and the gentle clink of metal against wood. You shuffle quietly toward the sound, eyes adjusting to the gentle brightness, and there it is, the squirrel enclosure. To call it a cage would be insulting. This is no crude wooden box or rusty trap. No, this is a miniature palace. Imagine a fine bird cage, but instead of a perch, it has ledges and tunnels. There's a wheel made from an old spinning hoop, a climbing post covered in braided straw, and a delicate cloth hammock suspended from 2 brass hooks. You'd swear the thing has curtains. Linen curtains. With lace trim. And in the middle of it all, Beatrix blinks at you, unbothered by your gawking. Welcome to the high art of 1600 squirrel couture and containment. Because if you were under the impression that squirrels lived in simple showboxes and snuck scraps off the floor, it's time to recalibrate. These creatures were not just pets, they were status symbols, and their accessories told a story all their own. The housewife joins you, her eyes crinkling with pride as she reaches in and lifts out a tiny collar. It's soft red leather, delicately stitched, and fastened with what looks like a silver button from a child's shoe. She wraps it around Beatrix's neck with the ease of practice. And no, Beatrix doesn't protest. She turns once, flicks her tail, and poses like she's ready for a very tiny, very exclusive portrait. So here's tonight's historical fact. Wealthy women in the 17th century sometimes commissioned elaborate enclosures for their pet squirrels. Ones made of carved cherry wood, polished brass, and lined with embroidered fabrics. These weren't just cages. They were homes within homes, little squirrel sanctuaries placed beside windows or near hearths so that the pets would have warm sunbeams and the company of passing humans. Some were even decorated to match the home's interior aesthetic. Squirrel decor was a thing. And it wasn't just about the cage. You soon learn that 1600 squirrel fashion was an actual category. Women sewed miniature collars out of silk ribbon and stiff lace, often dyed using crushed berries, onion skins, or even walnut husks. The collars had tiny bells, not always practical, sure, but wildly adorable, and some had name tags. One woman in London allegedly had a gold tag engraved with the words, "Sweet Pip, my rascal." Pip was her squirrel, and her rascal, apparently, the fringe tidbit of the evening. A 1632 merchant's log mentions a shopkeeper in Bruges who made miniature garb for pets including, you guessed it, squirrel coats. Squirrel coats for squirrels. Fur-lined in some cases. Now, whether these were practical winter wear or novelty items is still up for debate. But what's not in question is the fact that someone thought, you know what would complete this look? A velvet cloak for a squirrel. You can almost hear the squeak of a squirrel sighing under the weight of fashion. Now, here's where it gets even more ridiculous, and oddly sweet. Some women created squirrel walks. These were essentially leashes, tiny lengths of ribbon or twine attached to collars so that squirrels could roam the room, or sometimes even the garden, without making a break for the treetops. Imagine a 17th century lady strolling through her herb garden, her squirrel tethered like a fluffy balloon behind her, pausing only to chew aggressively on a dandelion. Fashionable? Absolutely. Functional? Dubiously. But you better believe it made the neighbors talk. You pause for a moment, glancing at a small wooden shelf nearby. On it sit 3 squirrel-sized hats. Yes, hats. One is made of stiffened felt with a feather sticking out. Another has a tiny veil. The third is a bit battered, possibly gnawed on, and seems to have once been part of a doll's costume. Whether these hats were worn for practical reasons or for portrait sittings, no one knows for sure, but based on the stories being passed around the hearth, they were worn. At least once. Maybe even to church, although we'll chalk that up to exaggeration. And here's tonight's open scholarly debate. Were these squirrel accessories signs of affection, or were they part of a broader cultural movement toward anthropomorphing animals in ways that reflect human vanity? Some historians suggest that dressing pets was a gentle indulgence, a way to humanize the animal and feel closer to it. Others argue that it was a projection, women asserting control over something, anything, in a world that didn't let them control much else. The squirrel became a canvas for expression, rebellion, and, let's be honest, just plain fun. But practicality wasn't ignored. Some of these designs had real purpose. Tiny leather sheaths were sometimes fitted over sharp claws to protect furniture or clothing. Padding was added to wooden cage floors to prevent injury during play. Even squirrel hammocks had small anchor stitches so that they wouldn't spin or collapse under a squirrel's weight. The design thought going into this stuff was surprisingly advanced. Now, let's not pretend every squirrel was thrilled about being a living fashion doll. Some hated collars. Others tore off leashes and escaped into flour sacks or chimney flues. There's a story passed around the spinning circle about a squirrel named Thomas who flung his bonnet into a soup tureen mid-dinner. Ruined the stew, but made the guests laugh, the hostess reportedly said, not sounding remotely sorry. You step back from the enclosure and notice how even the cage has been customized. Tiny initials carved into the side, miniature shutters over a squirrel-sized window, and a small wooden perch shaped like a heart. These animals weren't just kept. They were adored, pampered, doted on to the point of parody. And yet, you get it. In a world where women's expressions of creativity were limited to embroidery, cooking, and child-rearing, the pet squirrel became a walking, scampering outlet for whimsy. You couldn't paint a cathedral, but you could embroider a squirrel's pillow with gold thread. You couldn't go to university, but you could invent a squirrel leash that allowed your tiny friend to explore the garden without becoming owl food. Even the tools used to care for them had style. Feeding trays carved from walnut shells. Water dishes repurposed from broken teacups. A grooming brush made from a toothpick and goose feathers. Every detail reflected care and intent, and a deep desire to bring beauty into the everyday. Suddenly, Beatrix stirs. She stretches, yawns in that hilarious rodent way where the jaw moves but the eyes stay closed, and hops out of the cage entirely. No fear. No hesitation. She scrambles up the housewife's shoulder and perches like a well-trained parrot. The collar gleams. The tiny bell jingles. And for a brief moment, you wonder if you've stepped into a dream stitched together by a very tired seamstress with a great sense of humor. The housewife laughs and hands you one of the extra collars. Just in case you find your own, she says. You turn it over in your hands, feeling the soft leather and the worn buckle. It smells faintly of lavender and old stories. It feels like something that should be in a museum. But here, it's just another part of the day. And as Beatrix snuggles into the folds of a quilted shoulder cape, tail wrapped around her like a sleeping question mark, you realize something. This wasn't just a pet trend. It was a whole aesthetic. A lifestyle. Squirrel chic, 1600s edition. Sleepy, silly, and somehow deeply human. The sun is higher now, pouring in through the wavy-glass windows with a kind of soft golden insistence. Breakfast has come and gone, salted porridge, a slice of yesterday's oatcake, and tea so strong it could probably take down a small bear. The house is humming again, filled with quiet movement, the creak of the butter churn, the rustle of linen being folded, the swish of skirts brushing across rush-covered floors. But in one corner, something else is happening. Something much quieter, much stranger. You watch as Beatrix, your favorite overindulged squirrel roommate, crouches in a little wooden circle on the table. The housewife sits beside her, holding a thimble between two fingers, tapping it gently on the table in a pattern. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Every time she does it, Beatrix straightens. She watches. She waits. And when the rhythm ends, she scampers to a tiny cloth pouch nearby, opens it with her teeth, and removes a bit of almond. Carefully, like she's obeying some ancient code of table manners. You stare. The housewife smiles without looking up. Takes a few weeks, she says casually. Sometimes more. Depends on their temperament. As if training a squirrel to associate sound patterns with food is just a Tuesday hobby. Which, in this house, it is. Welcome to the bizarre but brilliant world of early squirrel psychology. To be clear, no one in the 1600s was publishing treatises titled on the cognitive training of tree-dwelling rodents. But that doesn't mean the women raising them didn't understand, intuitively, how to shape behavior. They watched. They experimented. And they learned, quickly, that squirrels are both remarkably clever and absolutely chaotic. Which is, frankly, part of the charm. Here's your historical fact. Writings from the late 1600s describe the practice of signal calling, where pet squirrels were taught to come to a specific whistle, clap, or knocking pattern. A record from 1684 mentions a noblewoman in Devon whose squirrel, named Jackie, would come forth at the tap of a shoehorn and await his treat. It sounds ridiculous, but these animals weren't being trained like circus acts. They were being gently conditioned, through repetition and reward, just like a toddler learning to fetch their bonnet or respond to a lullaby. Now, squirrels aren't easy students. Anyone who's seen one in the wild knows this. They panic. They scramble. They disappear into teapots and knock over every button jar in the room. But housewives learned how to work around that. They started with routines, feeding at the same time every day, associating scents, lavender, thyme, nutmeg, with safety and affection. Some even sang to their squirrels. Quiet, repetitive songs. Lullabies that the animals came to recognize as a kind of emotional cue. Sound became safety. And then there were visual signals. The lifting of a finger. The lowering of a spoon. One woman claimed she could get her squirrel to stop mid-scurry simply by tilting her head a certain way. Was it true? Who knows? But it doesn't matter, because the stories are so wonderfully human. They show how people reached across species with nothing but time, kindness, and a few breadcrumbs. Here's your fringe tidbit. A woman in the Swedish court reportedly trained her squirrel to perform what she called the noble bow. She'd hold a grape above its head, and the squirrel would lower its front half and extend one paw, as if tipping a tiny invisible hat. Whether this actually happened or was just a bored court lady trying to impress her friends, well, that's up for debate. But the image? Priceless. The squirrel training process wasn't just about showmanship. It was practical, too. A well-trained squirrel was easier to care for. It didn't bolt at every noise. It didn't bite as often. It didn't chew holes through your lace under things. Well, not as many. Housewives learned to read their animal's body language. Ears twitching, tails curling, paws stiffening. These little signs told them when the squirrel was anxious, angry, sleepy, or ready to dart for the curtains like an acrobat late for rehearsal. And now, the scholarly debate of the evening. Could squirrels truly be trained, or were humans simply adapting to their quirks and calling it training? Some historians argue that the behaviors described in journals and letters were more about habituation than true learning, that the squirrels weren't obeying commands so much as responding to a familiar environment. Others argue the opposite, that early modern women were pioneers of animal behaviorism long before the term existed. They observed patterns, repeated stimuli, and adjusted strategies. Call it what you want, conditioning, training, bribery with nuts, but it worked. You watch as Beatrix leaps onto a carved wooden perch, pausing dramatically at the top. The housewife claps twice. Beatrix spins in place and dives gracefully into a small padded basket like she's been choreographed by a rodent-sized ballet master. It's not perfect. Her landing is more tumble than pirouette, but the pride in her eyes is unmistakable. She knows she did something. She knows she'll be rewarded. A tiny slice of dried fig is presented like a medal of honor. Do they ever misbehave on purpose? You ask. The housewife smirks. All the time. Because here's the thing no one tells you. Squirrels are little comedians. They know how to get attention. Drop a spool of thread on the floor. Knock a spoon off the table. Pause, look back, and wait for the reaction. If you laugh or yell, they've learned something. Cause and effect. And, much like toddlers or TikTok creators, they'll keep doing whatever gets the biggest response. You sit down on a low stool and observe the training tools. A tiny bell. A stick with a colored cloth at the tip. A jar of treats. A whistle made from bone. It's not high science, but it's a whole system. And you realize that training a squirrel in the 1600s required the same things it would today. Patience, consistency, and a surprising amount of cheese. Now, the jokes practically write themselves here. One lady wrote that her squirrel would only perform if her husband wasn't in the room. Another claimed her squirrel was better at remembering commands than her youngest son. And another swore that her pet refused to climb when it was feeling melancholic, a phrase she wrote underlined, as if the squirrel's mood swings were simply a matter of poetic temperament. But underneath all the laughter, there's something kind of beautiful. These women, often confined to domestic routines that dulled the mind and stiffened the spirit, found joy and purpose in these tiny acts of training. They took an animal known for chaos and turned that chaos into connection. The fire crackles behind you. Beatrix curls into her basket, nose twitching. The housewife strokes her tail gently, like brushing a silk ribbon. She knows she's clever, she says softly. That's why she misbehaves. And somehow, that makes perfect sense. You rest your elbows on the table and look around at the quiet evidence of a hidden world. A bell-shaped feeder. Scratches on the windowsill from practiced landings. A bit of chalk near the hearth, where the housewife's daughter has written "Good girl, B" in wobbly letters. This wasn't just training. It was relationship building. A kind of silent language between two species, taught not in books, but in glances, taps, songs, and snacks. And as the light fades slightly and the room eases back into soft shadows, you feel a little more connected to the past than before. Because love, it turns out, isn't always loud or grand. Sometimes, it's shaped like a squirrel spinning in a circle for a thimbleful of almond paste. You return to the kitchen in the early afternoon, drawn by the low rustle of fabric and the unmistakable sound of tiny claws scrabbling on wood. Beatrix is up again, bright-eyed and mischievous, perched delicately on the edge of a low stool. Her nose twitches. Her eyes dart from side to side like a pair of twitchy marbles, always calculating. She knows something is about to happen. And she's right. The housewife enters the room, cradling a small wooden tray in one hand and a folded cloth in the other. You can smell what's on the tray before you see it. Something nutty, something sweet, something faintly herbal. She sets the tray on the table, unwraps the cloth, and reveals a tiny feast. Sliced apples, toasted oat crumbs, dried currants, a smear of honey on a walnut half, and the crown jewel, 2 full almonds, split perfectly down the middle like a squirrel's fantasy come true. This, it turns out, is the training banquet. You watch with growing amusement as Beatrix's whole body seems to vibrate with anticipation. She isn't moving yet, but her claws flex. Her tail flicks. Her ears rotate like tiny satellite dishes. She knows the routine, and she knows that being too eager will ruin everything. There's a performance ahead, and the reward is worth the wait. So what does a 1600 squirrel want most in the world? The answer isn't always what you'd expect. Sure, nuts were the staple, and almonds were squirrel gold. But these clever creatures developed preferences. Some favored dried figures. Others were mad for rosehip mash. One particularly well-documented pet squirrel, named Pickle, of all things, refused all food except raw egg yolk and would throw tantrums if offered anything else. And by tantrum, we mean knocking over inkwells and chewing the corners off psalm books. And then there were visual signals. The lifting of a finger. The lowering of a spoon. One woman claimed she could get her squirrel to stop mid-scurry simply by tilting her head a certain way. Was it true? Who knows? But it doesn't matter, because the stories are so wonderfully human. They show how people reached across species with nothing but time, kindness, and a few breadcrumbs. Here's your fringe tidbit. A woman in the Swedish court reportedly trained her squirrel to perform what she called the noble bow. She'd hold a grape above its head, and the squirrel would lower its front half and extend one paw, as if tipping a tiny invisible hat. Whether this actually happened or was just a bored court lady trying to impress her friends, well, that's up for debate. But the image? Priceless. The squirrel training process wasn't just about showmanship. It was practical, too. A well-trained squirrel was easier to care for. It didn't bolt at every noise. It didn't bite as often. It didn't chew holes through your lace-under things. Well, not as many. Housewives learned to read their animal's body language. Ears twitching, tails curling, paws stiffening. These little signs told them when the squirrel was anxious, angry, sleepy, or ready to dart for the curtains like an acrobat late for rehearsal. And now, the scholarly debate of the evening. Could squirrels truly be trained, or were humans simply adapting to their quirks and calling it training? Some historians argue that the behaviors described in journals and letters were more about habituation than true learning, that the squirrels weren't obeying commands so much as responding to a familiar environment. Others argue the opposite, that early modern women were pioneers of animal behaviorism long before the term existed. They observed patterns, repeated stimuli, and adjusted strategies. Call it what you want, conditioning, training, bribery with nuts, but it worked. You watch as Beatrix leaps onto a carved wooden perch, pausing dramatically at the top. The housewife claps twice. Beatrix spins in place and dives gracefully into a small padded basket like she's been choreographed by a rodent-sized ballet master. It's not perfect. Her landing is more tumble than pirouette, but the pride in her eyes is unmistakable. She knows she did something. She knows she'll be rewarded. A tiny slice of dried fig is presented like a medal of honor. Do they ever misbehave on purpose? You ask. The housewife smirks. All the time. Because here's the thing no one tells you. Squirrels are little comedians. They know how to get attention. Drop a spool of thread on the floor. Knock a spoon off the table. Pause, look back, and wait for the reaction. If you laugh, or yell, they've learned something. Cause and effect. And, much like toddlers or TikTok creators, they'll keep doing whatever gets the biggest response. You sit down on a low stool and observe the training tools. A tiny bell. A stick with a colored cloth at the tip. A jar of treats. A whistle made from bone. It's not high science, but it's a whole system. And you realize that training a squirrel in the 1600s required the same things it would today. Patience, consistency, and a surprising amount of cheese. Now, the jokes practically write themselves here. One lady wrote that her squirrel would only perform if her husband wasn't in the room. Another claimed her squirrel was better at remembering commands than her youngest son. And another swore that her pet refused to climb when it was feeling melancholic, a phrase she wrote underlined, as if the squirrel's mood swings were simply a matter of poetic temperament. But underneath all the laughter, there's something kind of beautiful. These women, often confined to domestic routines that dulled the mind and stiffened the spirit, found joy and purpose in these tiny acts of training. They took an animal known for chaos and turned that chaos into connection. The fire crackles behind you. Beatrix curls into her basket, nose twitching. The housewife strokes her tail gently, like brushing a silk ribbon. She knows she's clever, she says softly. That's why she misbehaves. And somehow, that makes perfect sense. You rest your elbows on the table and look around at the quiet evidence of a hidden world. A bell-shaped feeder. Scratches on the windowsill from practiced landings. A bit of chalk near the hearth, where the housewife's daughter has written "Good girl, B" in wobbly letters. This wasn't just training. It was relationship building. A kind of silent language between two species, taught not in books, but in glances, taps, songs, and snacks. And as the light fades slightly and the room eases back into soft shadows, you feel a little more connected to the past than before. Because love, it turns out, isn't always loud or grand. Sometimes, it's shaped like a squirrel spinning in a circle for a thimbleful of almond paste. You return to the kitchen in the early afternoon, drawn by the low rustle of fabric and the unmistakable sound of tiny claws scrabbling on wood. Beatrix is up again, bright-eyed and mischievous, perched delicately on the edge of a low stool. Her nose twitches. Her eyes dart from side to side like a pair of twitchy marbles, always calculating. She knows something is about to happen. And she's right. The housewife enters the room, cradling a small wooden tray in one hand and a folded cloth in the other. You can smell what's on the tray before you see it. Something nutty, something sweet, something faintly herbal. She sets the tray on the table, unwraps the cloth, and reveals a tiny feast. Sliced apples, toasted oat crumbs, dried currants, a smear of honey on a walnut half, and the crown jewel, 2 full almonds, split perfectly down the middle like a squirrel's fantasy come true. This, it turns out, is the training banquet. You watch with growing amusement as Beatrix's whole body seems to vibrate with anticipation. She isn't moving yet, but her claws flex. Her tail flicks. Her ears rotate like tiny satellite dishes. She knows the routine, and she knows that being too eager will ruin everything. There's a performance ahead, and the reward is worth the wait. So what does a 1600 squirrel want most in the world? The answer isn't always what you'd expect. Sure, nuts were the staple, and almonds were squirrel gold. But these clever creatures developed preferences. Some favored dried figures. Others were mad for rosehip mash. One particularly well-documented pet squirrel, named Pickle, of all things, refused all food except raw egg yolk and would throw tantrums if offered anything else. And by tantrum, we mean knocking over inkwells and chewing the corners off psalm books. Here's your historical fact. Several recipe books from the 1600s included side notes for pet feeding, some of which mention how to sweeten nuts or preserve fruit for small animals. One note, scrawled in the margin of a Yorkshire housewife's herbal manual, reads, "Boil almonds in rose water for the creature, calms its tempers and sweetens breath. So yes, even in a century when humans bathed maybe twice a month, someone cared whether their squirrel had minty fresh breath. Now for the practical bit. These bribes weren't just treats, they were tools. In squirrel training, reward was everything. You didn't command with authority, you coaxed with snacks. Each time Beatrix completed a trick or responded to a signal, she got a morsel. The trick was keeping her interested. Too much reward too soon, she'd lose interest. Too little, she'd get bored and bite someone's finger. You see it play out now. The housewife claps twice. Beatrix perks up, then dashes in a tight circle. Another clap. She stops. The housewife lifts a hand, then lowers it slowly. Beatrix runs to her lap, places her front paws on her apron, and freezes. There's a pause. Then, reward. A halved acorn, roasted slightly over the hearth, lightly dusted with sugar. It disappears into her jaws faster than you'd think possible. You can't help but laugh. This isn't training, it's tiny theater. And Beatrix? She's the star. Now for your fringe tidbit. Some women went so far as to make squirrel candy. These were little clusters of mashed fruit, nuts, and grains bound with honey and sometimes sprinkled with dried lavender. One popular variation was called nut fudge, which was, frankly, probably a nightmare for the squirrel's teeth, but wildly beloved. A woman in rural France reportedly had to hide her squirrel's treats in her bodice to keep it from raiding her pantry. Of course, this led to some very awkward moments during church services. But back to Beatrix. The housewife now introduces a challenge, a miniature hurdle made from broom straw and button thread. She points. Beatrix hesitates, then bounds over it like a caffeinated goat. Applause. A dried raspberry this time. And yes, she sniffs it before eating, like a rodent sommelier evaluating a particularly bold vintage. This is where the scholarly debate comes in. Was this kind of reward-based training truly bonding, or just manipulation through snacks? Did the squirrel see the woman as a friend, or as a walking almond dispenser? Some historians argue that the animals were simply conditioned to associate certain humans with food, and that any affection was a side effect. Others believe that consistent feeding routines, coupled with gentle handling, created a deeper bond, one where mutual recognition and trust developed over time. Honestly, as Beatrix curls her tail and gives the housewife a sideways glance full of squirrel sass, it's hard not to believe in the relationship. That look says everything. I performed. I demand figure. And she gets it. Not every squirrel was so agreeable. Some played favorites, only responding to one person in the household. Others were temperamental, refusing to perform if it was raining, or if the fire was too low, or if someone in the room was wearing too much perfume. One diary entry describes a squirrel named Dandy who bit 3 guests in a row before being bribed back into his cage with a sugared hazelnut and a stern talking to. And the jokes. Oh, the jokes write themselves here. One woman reportedly said, "My squirrel is better behaved than my cousin's children and twice as clean." Another, "He prefers almond to acorn. Hasn't spoken to me since I ran out." And a third, "I fed him apple from my own hand, now he thinks he owns the orchard." But there was one problem with this level of indulgence. Squirrels, like toddlers, can become spoiled. Give them treats too often, and they stop responding. Make the treat too fancy, and they start turning up their noses at the basics. There's a note in one surviving recipe journal that says, "Too much fig will ruin the beast's discipline." You never thought you'd hear the phrase fig-induced anarchy, but here we are. Still, the housewife has it down to an art. She varies the snacks. She uses gestures sparingly. She never gives a treat unless Beatrix has earned it, even if earning it means balancing on a teacup for 5 seconds while looking adorable. It's a routine, a dance, and both partners know the steps. You notice a small storage jar tucked beside the hearth. Its label reads 4B. Inside are neat rows of dried fruits, seeds, and a few whole walnuts. The housewife catches your glance and chuckles. She won't eat the ones from the market, she says. Only the ones I dry myself. Of course she does. You sit back, smiling. There's something incredibly tender about all this. The thoughtfulness, the patience, the ridiculousness of making a custom treat menu for a creature that would probably eat a shoelace if given the chance. But also the respect. The housewife doesn't treat Beatrix like a toy. She treats her like a guest, a family member, an eccentric aunt with a nut obsession and zero boundaries. As the training session winds down, Beatrix climbs into the crook of the housewife's elbow and curls up. No more treats. No more tasks. Just the warm comfort of a familiar lap and the lingering scent of almonds. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet settle around you. There's something magical in this moment, something oddly modern. A woman, a squirrel, and the shared language of snacks and affection. It's almost enough to make you want to adopt one. Almost. The next room you wander into is unlike the quiet, homey kitchen where Beatrix trained like a nut-powered gymnast. This space smells faintly of lavender water and polished wood. The chairs are taller, the table is longer, and on the mantel sits a portrait of a stern-looking woman with a truly magnificent ruffled collar. This is the parlor, a place not for porridge and porridge-stirring squirrels, but for visitors, tea, and what might best be described as unnecessary pageantry. And guess who's sitting in the middle of it all? Beatrix. But she's not just lounging on a cushion like some pampered parrot. No, Beatrix is wearing a hat. A tiny, feathered hat that looks like it was stolen from the world's smallest Shakespearean actor. She's also seated beside a doll-sized tea service and appears to be in the middle of a photo, portrait, session. You blink. You stare. You consider whether this is all a long, elaborate joke played on you by history itself. The housewife enters in her finer dress, lace cuffs, silver thread embroidery, and a quiet sense of pride that practically floats around her like perfume. "It's Tea Thursday," she says, as if this explains everything. You do your best not to laugh. Because what you're seeing is, quite literally, a squirrel tea party. And this, as it turns out, is just the beginning. You see, once squirrels became household fixtures, it was only a matter of time before people began elevating them. Not just training or taming, but adorning, celebrating, and eventually, turning them into miniature, furry status symbols. So here's your historical fact. In the wealthier homes of the 1600s, especially among aristocratic women and merchant families flush with new money, pets weren't just animals, they were accessories. And squirrels, with their expressive eyes and acrobatic charm, became unlikely darlings of the early domestic fashion scene. They were dressed in ribbons, placed in portraits, carried to garden parties. One French noblewoman reportedly brought her squirrel to the royal court wearing a harness sewn from gold-threaded lace. It peed on a bishop's robe. The bishop was not amused. The fringe tidbit tonight? A surviving sketchbook from 1677 includes illustrations of tiny garments, squirrel jackets, festive leashes, and one particularly cursed item labeled mask for theatrical mischief. Scholars aren't sure if the mask was decorative or disciplinary, but it suggests that somewhere, at some point, a woman looked at her squirrel and thought, "What you need, darling, is flair." And flair they got. Upper-class ladies began commissioning accessories for their squirrels. Not just ribbons or hats, but whole wardrobes, tiny cloaks, monogrammed harnesses, even jeweled collars in rare cases, though most opted for simple embroidery, lest their squirrels vanish into a tree wearing the family fortune. Then came the events. You heard that right. Events. In some social circles, pet parades became a trend. Small gatherings where women brought their animals to display, much like you'd show off a new brooch or hat. And squirrels? Oh, they were showstoppers. Agile. Unique. Trained to sit still just long enough for polite applause before launching into chaos and gnawing the fringe off someone's tablecloth. They were, as the teens say, a whole vibe. Now let's dip into the scholarly debate. Were these elaborate displays of squirrel fashion and tea time etiquette genuine affection, or performative opulence? Some historians believe the pet parades and costumed rodents were a way for women to reclaim a bit of fun in a society that rarely allowed them public authority. Others argue it was all for show, a competitive performance masked as leisure. Your squirrel wore pink tulle? Mine has lace imported from Florence. You watch now as Beatrix lifts a cup, no doubt emptied of whatever squirrel-appropriate infusion once filled it, and places her paws on the rim with what could only be described as dignified chaos. The housewife chuckles. She prefers chamomile. Hops make her twitchy. You stifle your grin. Because of course she does. Even the table has been scaled. Tiny plates. Dried cranberry muffins the size of your thumb. A napkin folded into the shape of a squirrel tail. It's absurd. It's excessive. It's deeply unnecessary. It's wonderful. Of course, not every squirrel loved the high life. Many resisted clothing. Others chewed their bonnets or flung them into the hearth. And some were just downright rude. One noblewoman wrote, "My little darling piddled on my mother's glove and bit the lace from my cuff. He is forgiven, as he looked deeply ashamed afterward." Let's take a moment to appreciate the humor. A guest once remarked, "Her ladyship's squirrel dines better than I do." Another, "If I should be reincarnated, let it be as her squirrel, well-fed, adored, and never made to listen to sermons." And then there was the infamous Mrs. Dallowby, who said quite seriously, "He refused the biscuit, but took the raspberry tart. I admire his discernment." But even with all the sparkle, the squirrel remained a squirrel. Fancy hats didn't change that. Beatrix eventually tires of the spectacle, hops down from the table, and scurries up to a shelf where she nestles among porcelain figurines like some living ornament. She plucks off her own hat, which is either a sign of rebellion or just discomfort. Either way, her point is made. This brings us to a quieter truth. While all the pageantry might seem absurd, at its heart is something soft and genuine. These displays weren't about turning animals into toys. They were about creating joy, connection, and, perhaps, a little rebellion wrapped in velvet and lace. Because for a 1600s housewife, especially one with means but limited freedom, a squirrel in a hat wasn't just whimsical, it was power. The ability to create, to decorate, to nurture, to control something, gently, lovingly, in a world that so often dictated her own role. You sip from your own cup of pretend tea, the parlor glowing around you with candlelight and the faint scent of sugared nuts. It's all so ridiculous. And all so beautiful. Beatrix curls up now on a windowsill pillow, tail wrapped around her body, hat beside her like a discarded crown. She's done being fancy for the day. She's ready to nap. And as the house quiets and the sunlight begins its slow descent through dusty panes, you understand something. Maybe the hat didn't matter. Maybe the jewels were just for show. But the love, that part was real. The parlor is peaceful again, the tea service packed away and Beatrix back in her preferred state, undressed, untamed, and dozing on a pillow beside the window. The hat lies abandoned on the floor like a forgotten prop from a rodent play. The scent of lavender hangs in the air, but it's accompanied by something sharper now. Wood dust? Linen? A hint of vinegar? You wrinkle your nose. Then you see it. One corner of the embroidery stand has been chewed. Not just nibbled, but thoroughly, maliciously, shredded, as if Beatrix had declared war on neat corners and floral patterns. The housewife notices too, sighs, and picks up the edge of the damaged frame. Again, she mutters, with the tired resignation of someone who has made peace with mild destruction. And just like that, you arrive at a less glamorous chapter of squirrel companionship, the toothy truth. Because for all their charm, their ribbons, their little hats and table manners, squirrels are, how to put this delicately, furry wrecking balls with fangs. They chew everything. And they don't just chew out of hunger. They chew out of instinct, out of boredom, out of pure, unrepentant glee. Let's start with the biology. Here's your historical fact. Squirrels, like other rodents, have incisors that never stop growing. Ever. To keep those teeth manageable, they must gnaw. It's not optional, it's dental care. And unfortunately, antique furniture, silk-lined wall hangings, and the occasional leather shoe happen to make excellent chew toys. You notice now how many small damages dot the room. Chair legs scraped raw. A door frame splintered near the bottom. One suspicious patch in the woven floor mat that looks like it met a very determined pair of teeth. The housewife follows your gaze and shrugs. She only does it when she's cross, she says. Or excited. Or sleepy. Or when the weather's strange. So, always, then. It's time for tonight's fringe tidbit. One 1600s housewife, whose squirrel was named Porridge, bless her, actually built a gnawing wall in her cellar, lined with discarded apple wood and bark, specifically to redirect his chewing. Apparently, it worked. Porridge chewed a small tunnel straight through it and into the pantry. The solution became the problem. Classic. You hear other stories: shredded bed linens, chewed bonnet ribbons, lace trim reduced to dusty thread. One woman reported waking to find her squirrel nibbling her hair. Just the ends, she wrote, though he showed preference for the left side. She tried sleeping in a cap after that. The squirrel shredded the cap. Now for the scholarly debate. Some argue that the tendency of 1600s housewives to tolerate this kind of damage reflects an unusually high threshold for chaos. Others believe it reflects the deep emotional investment in their pets, that love, even in 1600s England, could override the desire for perfect upholstery. She chewed through my prayer book, wrote one woman in her diary, but I forgave her, for she looked so proud of it. You sit beside the hearth now, watching Beatrix stir in her sleep, occasionally flexing her tiny jaws as if chewing dream acorns. The housewife fetches a box from beneath the table and opens it to reveal a squirrel's chew kit. Yes, a chew kit. Inside, small sticks of fruitwood, woven grass knots, hard-baked crusts of old bread, and even a few dried corn cobs. These, she says, are her favorites. If I don't leave them out, she'll take it out on the baseboards. It's oddly touching. And practical. The housewife isn't fighting Beatrix's nature, she's adapting to it. Redirecting it. Providing healthy outlets for an unstoppable force of nature dressed in fluff and big brown eyes. You notice, too, how the furniture has been subtly modified. One footstool has a copper band wrapped around its legs, gnaw-proof. A cupboard door has small brass edges to protect it from curious jaws. This house has evolved around its squirrel. It's not that the family has made room for her, it's that they've restructured the entire environment to survive her. Let's talk safety. As much as Beatrix might chew through pillow seams and gnaw holes in wall stockings, the danger went both ways. Squirrels' sharp teeth made them capable of doing real damage. One misjudged play nip, and you could end up with a bloody finger and a very guilty rodent. A few women even wrote about needing squirrel gloves for feeding time. Thin leather mitts used not to discipline, but to avoid spontaneous finger puncture. Some housewives took it further. They filed their squirrel's teeth, carefully, gently, using bits of pumice or bone. This was controversial even then. Some believed it was cruel, others saw it as necessary for safety and furniture preservation. But the consensus was clear: squirrels were wonderful companions. so long as you respected their teeth. And the jokes. Oh, the jokes are endless. She chewed through my wedding corset. I took that as a sign from God. He nibbled my husband's sermon. It improved it. My squirrel ate half a mousetrap. Survived. Smiled at me. But not all incidents were funny. A woman in Wiltshire wrote about losing her squirrel, Flora, after she chewed through a pouch of powdered nutmeg. The resulting sickness lasted 2 days. Flora never quite recovered. It's a reminder that behind every toothy anecdote, there were real emotions, real losses. These animals weren't jokes, they were part of the family. So why keep them, you ask? Why tolerate the damage, the chaos, the ever-growing dental menace that lives to chew? The housewife answers it simply. Because she makes the house feel alive. And as you look around, the worn edges, the patched corners, the softened places where squirrel and woman have collided over time, you begin to understand. Beatrix's teeth, for all their trouble, have shaped this home. Not just physically, but emotionally. They've carved stories into every corner. Laughter, frustration, love. Because, in truth, living with a squirrel is like living with a toddler crossed with a garden gnome crossed with a tiny, unstoppable carpenter. And somehow, that's exactly what makes it wonderful. By now, you've come to understand that Beatrix is no ordinary rodent. She's not just a pet, or a hobby, or a problem with teeth. She's a companion, a performer, a serial chewer, and, oddly enough, a social catalyst. Because what begins as a woman keeping a squirrel soon becomes something bigger. Something that pulls neighbors into conversation, sparks rivalries, inspires envy, and even, yes, solidifies friendships. In a world without Instagram, the 1600s housewife had her squirrel. And it was always the talk of the village. It starts simply enough. A neighbor stops by, ostensibly to return a borrowed spoon or a jar of stewed quince. But what she's really doing is peeking into the kitchen, casually checking to see if Beatrix is wearing her little collar today. "Oh," she says, trying to sound disinterested, "she looks well." But her eyes flick to the ribbon at Beatrix's neck, and you just know she's about to go home and try to copy it. That's right, squirrel envy was real. Welcome to the squirrel social scene. Here's your historical fact. In towns and parishes from London to Lyon, domestic pets were commonly mentioned in letters and casual records. But by the late 1600s, references to squirrels start appearing with curious frequency, and usually in a social context. They were gifts between households, topics of gossip, indicators of refinement. If you had a squirrel, and it was trained, you were someone people talked about. If your squirrel wore matching ribbon to your gown on Sundays, oh, you were a trendsetter. The fringe tidbit for tonight. One aristocratic diary from 1685 mentions a lady who arrived at a garden party with her squirrel perched on her shoulder draped in a pearl collar, with its tail powdered lightly in chalk for effect. Apparently, the hostess was not pleased. Powdered tails were so last season. But not every squirrel owner belonged to the gentry. In fact, most didn't. Even among common folk, housewives took tremendous pride in their furry companions. It wasn't about class, it was about creativity, care, and charisma. Having a squirrel said something about you. It meant you had the patience to train, the softness to nurture, and the courage to share your home with a creature that might, at any moment, chew your bonnet. And naturally, squirrel owners began to seek each other out. The housewife you've come to know, a quiet but clever woman with deft fingers and a sense of humor sharp enough to trim hedges, hosts weekly gatherings. You witness one now, as the parlor fills with women in neatly mended dresses, embroidered shawls, and practical shoes. And in their arms, squirrels. Squirrels in baskets. Squirrels wrapped in scarves. Squirrels peeking out from pockets with eyes like polished beads, tails flicking, noses twitching. It's Squirrel Club. They don't call it that, of course. They call it tea and talk. But everyone knows why they are here. Each woman takes a turn placing her squirrel on the long table at the center of the room. The animals sniff each other cautiously, tails fluffing. One tries to steal a biscuit. Another leaps onto the curtain rod and refuses to come down until bribed with a toasted oat. It's chaos. It's delightful. And it's surprisingly structured. Each woman shares her week's progress, what her squirrel learned, what mischief it caused, what it chewed through. There's applause, laughter, the occasional gasp. One woman proudly announces that her squirrel has learned to play dead. She demonstrates. The squirrel immediately bolts under the table. Everyone claps anyway. You sit quietly at the edge of the gathering, taking it all in. It's not just about the animals. It's about the women. In a world that often silence their ambitions, minimize their intellect, and confine their social lives to church pews and market stalls, Squirrel Club is liberation. It's play. It's status. It's joy. Now here's tonight's scholarly debate. Was the rise of these pet-based social rituals a form of proto-feminist community building, or just a way to pass time in a domestic world of narrow routines? Historians argue both sides. Some say these gatherings allowed women to create informal networks of support, where knowledge was exchanged and emotional lives were validated. Others suggest that squirrel talk was merely an extension of the household role, just another way to bond over children, recipes, and linen mending. But as you watch the room erupt in laughter when one squirrel dunks its paw into a cup of milk and then smacks another on the nose, you realize the answer doesn't really matter. What matters is the spark in these women's eyes. The rare chance to be seen, and heard, and maybe, just maybe, admired. Let's pause for a few well-earned jokes. One woman leans over and says, "My squirrel prefers men. I fear I've raised a flirt." Another sighs dramatically, "She stole my best earring. I caught her trying to bury it in the cabbage patch." And the third, with mock solemnity, "He sits on my husband's favorite chair. I let him. The squirrel has better manners." You look around and see that these women, who might otherwise have never had reason to gather, now share something meaningful. They've created a space. A squirrel-shaped doorway to connection. The afternoon passes in bursts of laughter and the occasional crash. There's a brief moment of panic when one squirrel escapes into the pantry and emerges covered in flour, looking very much like a ghost. No one is angry. Everyone's delighted. Eventually, the gathering winds down. One by one, the women gather their pets, their shawls, and their stories. Goodbyes are exchanged. Promises to return next week are murmured. And then the room is quiet again. Beatrix remains, curled in a ball on her cushion like a queen at rest after court. The housewife tidies up without hurry. You notice she's humming, something light, something content. The squirrel has brought her many things, chewed chair legs, sleepless nights, stained linens. But also companionship, connection, and this weekly reminder that she is more than a wife, more than a cook, more than the sum of her chores. She is a squirrel mom, and she's proud of it. Outside, the village is quiet, but you know that behind more than one curtain, a squirrel is curled on a lap, or gnawing gently on the corner of a hymn book, or preparing to be fussed over by another proud and slightly eccentric woman who knows exactly what it means to love something that occasionally pees on your best rug. Because sometimes, the simplest things, like a squirrel, create the richest lives. The sun has fully dipped beneath the horizon now. The garden has been tucked away into shadow, its soil cooling under the weight of the evening air. Inside, a single candle flickers in the hallway, and the house creaks quietly, the way all old houses do, as if it's remembering something. The mood has shifted. It's still peaceful, yes, but heavier now. There's something on the housewife's mind tonight, and it isn't compost or acorns or chew-proofing the footstools. It's conversation. Serious, sharp-edged conversation. And somehow, it's about squirrels. She sits by the fire now, Beatrix asleep in the crook of her elbow, her tail wrapped around her like a velvet sash. You settle into the worn armchair opposite her, watching as she stares into the flames, the flickering light dancing in her eyes. "Do you know what the curate said last week?" she asks suddenly. "Said I was too taken with beasts." Too taken. As if a squirrel is going to rob me of my virtue. Ah. So this is that night. Because while pet squirrels might seem whimsical and harmless to you, and to the other ladies who host squirrel tea parties and embroider miniature cloaks, not everyone in the 1600s was amused. In fact, as Beatrix and her ilk grew more popular, more visible, and more, well, fashionable, some people started to get uncomfortable. Here's your historical fact. In several sermons from the late 1600s, particularly in Puritan-influenced communities, clergymen began to mention pets, especially exotic or unusual ones, as signs of vanity and moral distraction. Women were cautioned against elevating beasts above duty, or devoting affection to the lesser creatures, rather than to their lord or husband. In less pious words, some people thought women were loving squirrels more than they loved God, or their husbands, or society's ideals. You stifle a laugh. The housewife does not. "It's jealousy," she says flatly. "That squirrel listens better than half the husbands in this town." You can't argue with her. Beatrix has proven to be smarter, more obedient, and arguably more hygienic than a good portion of the local men. And here's your fringe tidbit. In 1683, a pamphlet circulated in London entitled The Curious Woman and Her Four-Legged Fool, which criticized women for treating pets like children and warned that such behavior would unhinge the order of house and hearth. It argued that the rise of pet culture, particularly among women, was a symptom of a society in decline. And, in a final dramatic flourish, it accused squirrels of being devilish distractors from the female duty. Imagine being a rodent and also a social threat. This, of course, sparked counter-arguments. Some women wrote biting letters to periodicals and pamphlet printers defending their right to keep animals, claiming that companionship had nothing to do with morality. One anonymous author even penned a satirical tract titled The Virtues of Squirreldom, listing benefits such as encouragement of good posture when perched on shoulder, and superior judgment of character. Scholars today are still unsure if it was meant as protest or parody. And so we reach tonight's scholarly debate. Was the backlash against pet squirrels truly about morality and religion, or was it a disguised critique of women's growing domestic autonomy? Many modern historians lean toward the latter. After all, the squirrel itself wasn't the problem, it was what it represented. A woman choosing companionship outside of marriage or motherhood. A woman forming an identity that wasn't entirely tethered to a man, a child, or a church pew. Let's not forget, the 1600s were deeply hierarchical. Gender roles were carved into stone, or at least stitched into samplers. Men led, women followed. Homes were ruled by patriarchs. But what happens when the lady of the house chooses to devote her time, attention, and even her emotions to a little furry creature that doesn't obey those rules? It's subtle, it's soft, but it's rebellion. One joke that circulated in taverns, and we use joke loosely, was, a man may drink ale and be loved for it. A woman may pet a squirrel and be damned. You'd almost be impressed by how much drama they could squeeze into so few words. You ask the housewife if she ever thought about giving up Beatrix, just to avoid the gossip, the whispers, the judgment. She gives you a look that says she's forgiven Beatrix for chewing 3 hymnals, but will not forgive you for even asking. "Let them whisper," she says. "My squirrel brings me joy. What's their ale bring them? Headaches." Fair point. And there's something wonderfully ironic here. In trying to shame women into giving up their squirrels, critics only made them more determined to keep them. The more the church warned against vanity beasts, the more squirrels showed up in portraits. The more husbands grumbled about frilly collars and velvet leashes, the more women stitched acorn motifs into their embroidery samplers. They weren't just keeping squirrels. They were making a point. Of course, there were exceptions. Some men adored the squirrels, especially the trained ones. A clever squirrel could impress a visitor, charm a client, entertain a child. And, let's be honest, it gave the household something to talk about other than the weather or which cousin got arrested for poaching again. One man in Kent wrote proudly that his wife's squirrel could spin thrice in place and leap through a hoop with grace. He took it with him to the tavern once. The squirrel bit the innkeeper. He took it again the next week. But those were the exceptions. Most of the time, the squirrel was a woman's domain. And its very presence, on her shoulder, in her pocket, sleeping at her feet, became a quiet declaration of independence. A way of saying, I choose this joy. I shape this home. I make space for something that answers to me. Let's pause for the jokes. They were sharp, witty, and never written down in the big books, but they lived in whispers and in knowing glances. She talks more to her squirrel than her spouse. Can't say I blame her. Her pet wears silk. Her husband wears shame. If that squirrel ran for council, I'd vote for it. And you know what? So would you. You watch now as Beatrix stirs from her nap, stretches dramatically, and climbs onto the housewife's lap. She's too big to be a baby, too wild to be a lapdog, and too clever to be dismissed. She's just Beatrix, a creature of her own will, but a creature who chooses to stay. And somehow, that choice feels like a victory. The fire crackles, the shadows soften, and you realize that this, too, is history. Not the history of kings and conquests, but of small rebellions, of quiet power, of love wrapped in fur and whiskers and teeth that never stop growing. So when people ask if the pet squirrel was silly, or excessive, or a symptom of decline, the answer is simple. No. She was a revolution with a fluffy tail. The next morning dawns quietly. Mist hangs over the garden like sheer linen, and the house is unusually still, except for the scratch of a nib across paper coming from the parlor. You follow the sound, soft-footed and curious, until you find the housewife seated at a small writing desk tucked against the far wall. The window beside her glows pale with early light. Her hand moves with care and precision. Beatrix is curled up on a cushion nearby, naturally, but she's not asleep this time. She's posing. Yes, posing. You inch closer, peering over the housewife's shoulder, and there she is, sketched in fine strokes. Beatrix, regal, tail curled just so, nose pointed with delicate sharpness, one paw raised slightly, as if she's about to wave or declare attacks. The drawing is lovely. It's also detailed. Unnecessarily so. There's even a little ribbon etched onto her neck, though the real ribbon has long since fallen off and likely been buried behind a dresser. She won't sit still for long, the housewife mutters, blowing lightly on the ink. But she'll give me just enough. Beatrix, as if on cue, flicks her ear and turns in a full circle before resettling. It's not the first drawing. You look down and realize there's a whole stack of papers beneath the one she's working on, each sheet a variation on a theme. Squirrel on a pillow. Squirrel with a strawberry. Squirrel climbing a spool of thread. Squirrel, in one charmingly chaotic sketch, attacking a bundle of wool with the expression of a minor war god. And so you discover the hidden gallery, squirrel portraiture, a surprisingly rich and underappreciated thread in the fabric of 1600s domestic life. Here's your historical fact. While animal portraiture in this period was typically reserved for prized horses, hunting dogs, and the occasional noblewoman's parrot, there are surviving records of squirrels appearing in sketches, embroidery, and even painted miniatures. Often tucked into the corners of larger scenes, sometimes as jokes, sometimes as sincere mementos. One well-preserved 17th century sampler, stitched in silk and displayed in a small-town museum in Dorset, features a delicate border of vines, birds, and, yes, a squirrel in a red collar. Below it, the stitched phrase reads, "My joy in fur and nose." The squirrel isn't just an embellishment, it's the focus. Now for your fringe tidbit. A French noblewoman reportedly commissioned a full oil portrait of her squirrel in 1669, painted in the style of a formal aristocratic sitter. The animal was perched on a velvet cushion, framed by drapes and gold trim, with one paw resting on a miniature lute. It was titled Madame du Noisette. Some claim it was satire. Others say it hung in her salon for a decade. But for the average housewife, portraiture didn't mean oil and canvas. It meant sketchbooks, diaries, embroidery hoops, and the occasional watercolor on scrap parchment. Squirrels became muse and model alike, not just for their charm, but because drawing them was intimate, personal, an act of love and patience. You turn the pages of the housewife's sketchbook. Here's Beatrix in a clumsy first attempt, her tail too short, her head a bit triangular. Then, 10 pages later, a smoother rendering. The strokes are more confident, the posture more accurate. She's learned to capture the movement, the alertness, the personality. She has moods, the housewife says, not looking up. You have to draw the mood, not just the fur. There's a quiet pride in her voice. Not because she's boasting, but because she's seen something small and worth remembering, and she's made it last. This leads us into tonight's scholarly debate. Were these depictions purely sentimental, or did they reflect a deeper shift in how women of the time saw their role in domestic creativity? Some scholars argue that squirrel portraits were a form of personal narrative, tiny memoirs stitched in thread or ink. Others believe they were simply ways to practice skill, pass time, and personalize objects in a way that turned the mundane into the meaningful. But either way, one thing is clear: the act of drawing, stitching, or painting a squirrel was about presence. Attention. It required the woman to see her pet, not as a novelty or a burden, but as a creature worth rendering carefully, lovingly, line by line. And let's not ignore the humor in all this. One woman reportedly painted her squirrel sitting like a gentleman, with a bonnet upon his head, and proudly displayed it in the guest room. Another stitched a tapestry of her squirrel mid-leap, captioned with the words, "The thief of apricots." And still another claimed her squirrel once chewed through the charcoal pencil she was using to sketch him, mid-portrait. Self-critiquing artist, she called him. Even Beatrix, for all her noble posing, breaks form eventually. With a stretch and a sneeze, she rolls over and promptly begins cleaning her face with all the dignity of a soap opera duchess. The housewife laughs, then begins another sketch, capturing the moment. Not elegant, but real. You follow her into the next room and find yet another artifact of squirrel art, embroidery. Framed, hung above a small writing desk, is a sampler showing Beatrix in profile, framed by flowers and the phrase, "For every stitch, a memory." The stitches are neat, tight, and precise. Clearly practiced. This isn't the work of someone killing time. This is care. And that's what squirrel art truly represents. Not vanity or whimsy, but care. In a time when women's artwork was often undervalued or overlooked, the decision to immortalize one's pet in thread or paint was a declaration of significance. This mattered, each stitch says. She mattered. Let's not forget, in the 1600s, the home was the canvas. And the squirrel, the most charming subject available. You finish flipping through the sketches just as the morning light begins to sharpen. Beatrix hops down from her pillow, stretches dramatically, and disappears behind a curtain in search of mischief. The housewife caps her ink and smiles. She never poses the same way twice, she says. Of course she doesn't. She's a squirrel. But you get the sense that it doesn't matter. The sketches are never perfect. The embroidery is never exact. But the act of creating, of pausing, observing, translating affection into form, that's what lasts. You glance again at the drawings. One tail swishes too wide. One paw is awkward. One eye slightly crooked. They are beautiful, because they are true. And somewhere, across time, a woman sits at a window, sketching her squirrel into history. You don't notice right away. At first, everything seems perfectly normal. The sun is low, painting the floorboards in bands of gold and shadow. The kitchen smells of warm bread and thyme. A pot of something savory bubbles gently on the hearth, and the housewife hums under her breath as she slices carrots with a kind of calm that comes from years of knowing just how many slices a stew needs. But the cushion by the window is empty. The shelf beside the bread bin is undisturbed. The little dish of dried pear slices still sits untouched. You glance around. At first casually, then more carefully. The housewife hasn't said anything yet, but something is off. The usual rustling is gone. No sharp clicks of claws on wood. No scurrying from stool to table leg. No chittering, no tail flicking, no dramatic thumps from behind the curtains. Beatrix is gone. You finally break the silence. Where is she? The knife slows. The housewife's shoulders fall, just slightly. She slipped out this morning, she says quietly, when I opened the garden door. That's it. No theatrics, no weeping. Just a single, unadorned sentence. But it lands with the soft thud of real sorrow. A door left open. A moment of distraction. A streak of fur vanishing into the hedgerows. You sit with that. And so tonight, we enter the chapter no squirrel mother ever wants to write. The stories of the runaways, the lost, the gone. Here's your historical fact. Many women who kept squirrels as pets in the 1600s also experienced the heartbreak of losing them. Diaries, letters, and even marginalia in cookbooks are filled with tiny, aching references to escape. Gone through chimney, reads one line in a house ledger. Bolted when door ajar, says another. Fled into yew hedge. Did not return. Because squirrels are, at their core, wild. However tamed, however trained, however beloved, they are creatures of motion. A flash of wind, a noise too loud, the scent of fresh acorns in the woods beyond the garden fence, and instinct takes over. Sometimes they return. Sometimes they don't. The housewife sets the knife down. She's gone off before, she says. Always comes back. She likes the soft things. Blankets. Hearths. But there's a tightness in her voice. This time feels different. She shows you the hiding places she's already checked. Beneath the woodpile. Behind the salt barrels. The gap under the bread oven where Beatrix once stashed 3 biscuits and half a button. All empty. She's still hoping, you can tell. Still imagining that flick of a tail just around the corner. Still expecting to hear the tiny bell jingle from somewhere in the rafters. Now for your fringe tidbit. One woman in rural Derbyshire once posted hand-painted signs around her village after her squirrel vanished. The sign read, "Small beast, of copper hue, with white striped tail. Gentle of nature. Answers to thistle. Will bite for cheese." She received no replies, but 2 children did return a hedgehog wearing a button collar. Close enough, apparently. There are stories like this everywhere. A woman in Paris wrote to her sister that her squirrel, Emile, had disappeared after a thunderstorm. "I called for him with almond in hand," she wrote, "but he chose the trees instead." She ended her letter with a sketch of him, paw lifted in farewell. Another woman kept a list in the back of her recipe book. Not recipes, but dates. Monday. Gone. Tuesday. No sign. Wednesday. Still I wait. Below, she had scribbled, Love runs faster than reason. Let's talk about the scholarly debate here, because yes, even heartbreak can be academic. Some argue that the loss of a squirrel mirrored the deeper emotional risks women were beginning to take in this era. That loving an unpredictable, untamable creature forced them to confront the limits of their power. Others believe that writing about the loss, preserving it in journals and letters, was a way for women to practice emotional literacy in a society that rarely invited them to speak openly about longing, grief, or fear. Back in the kitchen, the housewife opens the back door, just a crack, and sets down a small saucer of honey. "She likes this," she says softly. "It's a ritual. Let's not pretend every squirrel returned. Some were lost forever, to hawks, to wild forests, to wheels and roads and rivers. Some may have found mates, built nests, raised tiny families in the treetops. Others might have fallen prey to the very instinct that once helped them thrive, curiosity. But there were homecomings, too. One woman recounted how her squirrel returned after 3 days, soaked, limping, and smelling of garlic. She never figured out the garlic part. Another found her pet curled inside a shoe in the laundry shed, shivering. And another opened her dresser drawer to find her squirrel calmly asleep on a silk handkerchief, having snuck in through the chimney. So they waited. And they hoped. Sometimes for days. Sometimes for weeks. And when the squirrel didn't come back, they remembered. They stitched their stories into fabric. They wrote tiny poems in the margins of Bibles. They sketched one last drawing, from memory. They lit a candle near the window. Not for superstition, just in case. Here come the sad, sweet jokes. Because even loss, in time, is softened by humor. She ran away the moment I washed her pillow. Never liked lavender. Gone to join the squirrels of better gardens, where no one steals their figures. I leave almonds by the gate. I suspect the neighbor's dog eats them. You sit with the housewife a while longer. Neither of you speaks. There's nothing to say. The fire crackles. The stew simmers. Outside, the mist thickens over the garden, wrapping everything in quiet. And just when you're about to rise, there's a sound. Faint. Indistinct. But there. The softest scratch at the door frame. The housewife freezes. Slowly, slowly, she turns the latch and pulls the door open. There she is. Muddy. Ragged. Smelling faintly of compost and, somehow, onion. But unmistakably, Beatrix. She blinks. Sniffs. Hops inside like she never left. The housewife doesn't scold. Doesn't cry. She just scoops her up and holds her close, burying her face in that ridiculous tail. You watch them, and something inside you loosens. Because sometimes, love does come back. Even on tiny, muddy paws. The house is quiet again. Peaceful, almost reverent. Beatrix is back, safe and warm, stretched out in an absurd little half-moon of fur on her windowsill cushion. Tail twitching now and then like she's chasing something in her dreams. The housewife moves softly, as if not to disturb the moment, placing a few stray breadcrumbs on a plate with the care one might give to arranging relics. But there's something new in the air tonight. A feeling. Something a little older, a little stranger, woven between the wooden beams and lingering in the corners of the room like chimney soot. You glance up from your seat by the hearth. Has she always come back? The housewife doesn't answer right away. She's stirring something, a potion, perhaps, or just her thoughts. Finally, she speaks, but her voice is quieter than usual. Not all of them do, she says. But some never really leave. And with that, the door creaks open on the next peculiar chapter of squirrel history. The stories, the whispers, the myths that clung to these tiny creatures long after they'd gnawed their last curtain cord. Because in a time when death came easily, science was still alchemy in better clothing. and mystery wove itself into every hearth and hedgerow. Even squirrels, yes, squirrels, acquired legends. Here's your historical fact. In various rural areas of 17th century England, as well as parts of northern France and the Low Countries, folklore surrounding animals was as common as recipes for onion poultice. And while most of these tales centered on cats, foxes, or birds, a surprising number involved squirrels, especially those kept as pets. Why? Well, they were clever, elusive, sometimes tame and sometimes wild. They could disappear for days and return unharmed, knew how to unlock things, and occasionally stole items only to return them later. In short, they acted like little forest spirits that had learned to drink tea and sleep in your linen drawer. Let's start with the most curious superstition: storm sense. It was widely believed among some housewives that squirrels could predict bad weather. If your squirrel spent the morning hiding in cupboards or gnawing its bedding to pieces, rain was imminent. If it refused food or stared silently at the wall, a tempest. In Cornwall, it was said that a squirrel who curled into a tight ball near the hearth signaled thunder. One woman even claimed her squirrel flattened herself against the floorboards before an earthquake, though no one else reported feeling anything. That leads us to tonight's fringe tidbit. In 1664, a pamphlet circulated in Yorkshire titled On the Portents of the Small Familiar, which included a list of animals with natural gifts of foresight. Among cats, geese, and certain types of beetles was the squirrel, who curls when death draws near. The author claimed that his aunt's squirrel refused to uncurl from a velvet pouch for 2 days before the passing of a local vicar. Coincidence? Probably. But compelling bedtime material? Absolutely. The tales don't stop at weather. Some believed squirrels brought luck, but only if they came willingly. If a squirrel entered your home and chose to stay, it was a blessing, a sign of warmth, kindness, and favor from the unseen world. But if you forced a squirrel to remain, legend warned that misfortune would follow. Bread would mold, milk would sour, embroidery threads would not themselves beyond rescue. Children would speak in riddles, though that last one may just be children being children. The housewife tells you, quite seriously, about a squirrel from her aunt's village, kept by an old sempstress who swore it whispered in her dreams. The squirrel, named Ash, only came down from the rafters on odd-numbered days. When it disappeared one Tuesday, the sempstress broke her hand falling from a ladder. It was a warning, she said. He always hated ladders. And then there are the ghosts. Yes, ghost squirrels. You shift slightly closer to the hearth. According to whispered tradition, a pet squirrel that died in the home could sometimes remain, not as a threat, but as a guardian. A flicker of fur in the corner of your eye. A sudden drop of a spoon from a high shelf. A faint, familiar squeak from an empty cage. Some women spoke of dreams, vivid ones, where they saw their old companions running alongside them through fields or kitchens bathed in starlight. It wasn't frightening. It was comforting. A reminder, they said, that love doesn't stop when breath does. One account tells of a woman who lost her squirrel during childbirth complications. Days later, her surviving daughter began leaving nuts by the cradle. For Pip, she said. The family never taught her the name. She claimed he sat on the windowsill and watched her sleep. You glance toward Beatrix, who snorts softly and adjusts her tail. The housewife notices your expression and chuckles. Oh, I'm not saying I believe all of it, she says. But sometimes I hear claws on the roof at night. And when I go up, nothing. Not even a bird. But a button might be missing. A single almond. Something turned upside down. She shrugs. I don't mind. Could be wind. Could be her grandmother. Could just be squirrels. This brings us to the scholarly debate. Were these tales genuine beliefs or simply narrative comfort? Did women of the era truly believe their squirrels haunted them? Or were these stories a way of expressing grief in a world that offered them few emotional outlets? Historians argue both sides. Some take the superstitions at face value, tracing them to older animal worship traditions. Others see them as coded language, ways for women to talk about death, absence, and longing without scandal or ridicule. Let's pause for a few superstitious chuckles, because yes, legends come with punchlines. One woman insisted her squirrel predicted her sister's engagement by burying a hair ribbon in the garden. Another believed her squirrel was the reincarnation of her first suitor, because he always stole my ink and refused to listen. And a third claimed that if her squirrel bit her left thumb, she would meet a stranger who owed her money. According to her diary, it worked. Twice. You sit in silence for a while, listening to the fire, the distant hoot of an owl, the slow, steady breathing of a squirrel who has no idea she might be the subject of minor folklore. The housewife blows out a candle and stretches, her movements gentle and slow. Outside, the wind has picked up, rustling leaves in long sighs. She smiles to herself. They never really go, she says. Even the ones that run. They leave things behind. And it's true. Sometimes it's a chewed curtain. Sometimes a stain on the pantry shelf that never quite washes out. And sometimes, it's just the feeling that a tiny pair of eyes is still watching. Curious. Affectionate. Ever so slightly mischievous. Beatrix shifts again, curling tighter. Her paws twitch in her sleep. Maybe she's dreaming of you. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the ghost of another squirrel, peeking in to say, she's mine now. The wind has shifted again. It now whistles gently beneath the door frames, slipping through the cracks in the windows with a whisper so soft it could be mistaken for breathing. The hearth glows low, its warmth steady but fading, and the world inside the house feels like it's caught in a slow, deliberate pause. You glance across the room. Beatrix is asleep again, belly gently rising and falling, curled into a circle so perfect it looks drawn. And the housewife? She's packing something. Not hurriedly, not with sorrow, but carefully, intentionally. A small bundle of Beatrix's things, the ribbon collar, the bell with the crack, a sketch or two, some dried fruit wrapped in waxed cloth. She folds a soft flannel scrap into a pouch and lays each item inside, like relics going into a memory chest. The squirrel stirs briefly at the sound of the cloth moving and then sighs deeply, tail twitching once before stilling again. She's getting older, the housewife says softly. Not slower, not yet, but softer, more still. You nod. You've noticed it too. The leaps a bit less frequent. The naps a bit longer. The chaos less chaotic. Still full of spirit, yes, but changing, settling. And just like that, you find yourself on the last leg of this gentle, winding journey. The closing days of squirrel companionship, when the energy has mellowed, the mischief has softened, and the home begins to adjust to the quiet. Here's your final historical fact. While early modern women rarely wrote about the exact ends of their pets' lives, there are fragments, passages tucked into prayer books, margins of almanacs, even scrawled at the bottom of grocery lists. One woman wrote, "She passed in sleep, beside my sewing box. I buried her beneath the plum tree." Another penned, simply, "No chittering today. Too much silence." These weren't declarations of grand grief, they were quiet acknowledgements. A way of honoring something small, but deeply felt. Tonight's fringe tidbit. In one surviving commonplace book from 1691, a widow in Somerset listed among her household treasures a jar of Beatrix's fur, brushed on the morning she ceased to leap. Not a taxidermy, not a relic, just fur. Because sometimes, we keep the smallest parts. But here's the twist. Not every squirrel vanished quietly. Some simply moved on. As fashions changed and the squirrel fad faded from parlors and portrait frames, many women let their pets return to the wild, or at least, to the garden. It wasn't abandonment. It was a kind of release. A mutual understanding. One woman wrote, "She stood at the open gate, turned back once, and then ran. I think she thanked me." You shift in your seat as the housewife lays down the last folded scrap, a bit of lace with a bite taken from one corner, and closes the pouch. If she decides to go, she says, I want her to have something soft with her. It's not sadness in her voice. It's reverence. And here comes the final scholarly debate. Did these quiet goodbyes represent emotional maturity, or societal limits? Were women forced to grieve privately because they had no place in public to express loss? Or were these rituals, the bundles, the notes, the tiny graves beneath lilacs, proof of a rich inner world that needed no validation? Historians continue to argue. But you believe it's both. The jokes still come, of course. Even here, at the edge of an era. She took my favorite nut, my favorite glove, and half my heart. My next squirrel will be less dramatic. Or more. Depends how I feel. She left with my best bonnet ribbon. I told the angels they'd better tie her down. And then, there's the quiet laughter. The kind that only comes after years of knowing someone who doesn't speak your language, but knows your every mood. The laughter of remembering the time she fell in the flower bin, or tried to bathe in a teacup, or chased the vicar out of the house with a shriek and a pomegranate rind. You feel the house begin to still completely now. The fire burns low. The housewife folds the bundle and places it in a drawer. Beatrix doesn't stir. And you understand, this isn't an ending. It's just the last curl of the tale, the gentle conclusion to a story that, like all the best ones, wasn't planned, wasn't perfect, but was loved all the way through. She'll wake tomorrow. She'll chew something. She'll dig up the garden again. She might even bite someone for fun. But one day, maybe not now, maybe not soon, she'll run off for the last time. And the housewife will stand at the gate, watch the trees, hold the silence, and feel full, not empty. Because Beatrix was never just a squirrel. She was an era, a rhythm, a revolution tucked into a linen apron and a basket of pears. She was joy, tiny, clawed, soft as dusk. And you got to see it. The hearth now glows as little more than an ember, its flicker lazy and golden against the stones. The wind outside has quieted. The house, the garden, even the breath of the squirrel, all have stilled. And you, curled gently in the folds of your blanket or resting against your pillow, begin to soften too. The story has ended not with a shout, but with a whisper. The images now blur together, lace-trimmed collars, tiny paws scratching at cupboard doors, the warmth of tea shared between a woman and her thieving roommate. You remember the way she napped in the sunlight, the way she spun in circles for a walnut, the way she came back after being lost. You're safe here. You're in a place where squirrels wear ribbons, women write poems about whiskers, and even the smallest companions leave the deepest echoes. No one rushes here. No one raises their voice. No one asks for more than what you're willing to give. Just a soft story. Just a quiet house. Just the love between a woman and her squirrel. Let yourself settle now. Feel your breath slow. Your muscles ease. Your eyes, perhaps already drifting, grow heavier with every heartbeat. You've made it to the end of the tale. You've walked the whole journey. And now, there's nothing more you need to do. Sleep is here. Like a tail curling around your thoughts. Like a whisper in the walls. Like a squirrel who chooses to stay. Good night.